Thank you, John, and thank you to everybody who's spoken. Thank you especially for this medal and this award from the Crawford Fund. In accepting it, I have to say, as many people in this room involved in international agricultural research will know, none of us do anything alone. There have been hundreds of people involved in the things I've done, the things I am still doing. So I'm proud to accept this on behalf of everybody. Some of those people are in this room. Thank you. What I'd like to talk about today follows on from the warm-up, as Peter Horn described his presentation. Peter, thank you very much for that, because it's given a context to what I wanted to say, as well as stealing some of my thunder. First of all, I want to say that there's a lineage in what I am talking about, so let me introduce it this way. This is World Food Day, October the 16th, which commemorates the founding of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in 1945. World Food Day each year is used to raise the profile of the precariousness of the world's food situation. We use it, in this case, to promote international agricultural research, because all of the analyses show that that is what drives increased food production and increased well-being around the world. The World Food Day is commemorating FAO's establishment. It's therefore fitting that the Crawford Fund is supporting today. The Crawford Fund is named after Sir John Crawford, a wonderful Australian, 5 foot high and a towering intellect, influenced the World Bank, the United Nations, FAO, Australian universities, Australian economics, and is honoured in the name of the Crawford Fund. The Crawford Fund was established initially under the auspices of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, one of the 4 learned academies in Australia, representing those people who can make a major contribution to Australia's future and Australia's place in the world. One of the founding fellows of the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering was Professor Derek Tribe, and the reason the Crawford Fund is founded within that academy is to give it the prestige to make it work. Since then, it did work. The Crawford Fund has grown into its own organisation with autonomy and a continuous presence in supporting international agricultural research, making sure the money keeps flowing, but also raising the profile in the public awareness. ACR, of course, sits in there as Australia's major contribution, and Sir John Crawford was one of the key people in the establishment of ACR itself. Derek Tribe I mentioned, I will mention again, because Derek Tribe not only was a predecessor of Dean John Fazakerley, he's a predecessor of mine, we're going back through generations. And that's the lineage I want to talk about, from World Food Day through Crawford Fund, through Sir John, through the Academy, through the faculty, through the Crawford Fund, is a lineage. And what I'm talking about in this title, which the Crawford Fund has asked me to speak about, the next gen, has been well introduced by Colin. The next gen is a critical aspect of how we can continue these contributions internationally. So with that general contextual introduction, let me talk about food security. Food security these days is much more than providing food. It's about micronutrients and it's about malnutrition. Yes, there are many other factors, but that's the main message I would like to have about whether it's food only or food quality. We'll also talk about many other things. But first of all, in terms of context, this is Maslow's pyramid of needs. We are all in this room somewhere in the top 3, and I hope we're in the top triangle. What I'm talking about is not what people that are in those situations at all. I'm not talking about food security in any terms that are talked about in Australia normally. I'm talking of people who are at the absolute bottom of the pyramid, looking for security for their families over food as a basic need. These are marginalised people, about 1 billion people in the world, people that are never seen even in tourism. I will also try and present through the first half of what I say, the successes. Peter has earlier introduced that sometimes there's optimism that science will solve the problems. Yes, that's true. That's a lazy sort of optimism. But to jog people out of that, the task that a person like me usually has standing here is to talk of a crisis. This crisis, that crisis, we're all going to die, an apocalypse is upon us. I don't have to give you the current examples, they're in the streets of Melbourne. So let me talk about success. Success fits into the context that's represented here in a gross summary of where the world's food comes from. Ex-USSR, read Ukraine. And the New World, the main food exporters, Western Europe, of course, is fine. Even populous Asia is doing pretty well. But in sub-Saharan Africa, West Asia, North Africa region, we have low yields. We have a huge difference between what we know is technically possible and what the yields actually are. We have high animal mortality, which means keeping more animals alive, a larger carbon footprint than is necessary to cater for deaths, and they are major food importers with population rising. That's the context. So we've had since 1960, 50 successful years. Now, if we remember, those of us who do remember, the 1960s was a period where we heard messages in school, in church, in anywhere else where we hung around, that famine was all over the world and this was the greatest moral disaster ever. What could we do about it? That's what motivated us to get into this business. The famine was averted by the science, some of which has been alluded to. More than 30% of the world hungry at that time. Today it's about 15%. In that time, population doubled, so that means, simple arithmetic, an extra 3 billion people have been fed. This is an amazing feat. It's so easily underestimated because it worked. This is the problem with success. Nobody notices if it seems an everyday occurrence. Another success has been that we have aid organisations, civil organisations, NGOs and philanthropists and the governments in developing countries actually working together. The longer it goes on, the more efficient the process, the more impact of what is invested. This has been done through policy, yield increases, vaccines, natural resource management and conservation, nutrition work, and so on. These are all great successes. Another success that should be mentioned, not only in this faculty, but in this university and in the wider country, Australians have always been highly represented. One of the things I've read suggests that Australians have been the most highly represented agricultural scientists in international agricultural research, proportional to population of the country. Australia wins on a lot of these counts because of a low population. But even if it's not true in every year, that's something that has been the case and it should continue. That's what the next gen is about. The CGIAR, which is not an acronym, it's just a poor name for the 15 international centres focused on the problems of food and the environment related to the poorest of the poor people that I described earlier. 10,000 staff approximately across 96 countries. The International Livestock Research Institute, of which I chair the board, is based in Kenya, Nairobi, Kenya. But in addition to these 96 countries, we have another 16 sites in the world where we have offices to coordinate research in regions. It's a major effort. And yet these centres do not do all the international agricultural research, of course. They act as foci for advanced research institutions around the world to integrate research conducted elsewhere to the needs of people in those regions. This university is one of those. ACR is one of the vehicles that funds and guides that activity, particularly in the Asian region. So we've had huge successes, and a detailed analysis by the International Food Policy Research Institute has shown that these 6 areas, integrated together, have been responsible for the successes to date. It's a complex diagram, even though it's made to look simple. But if I just talk about the headings briefly, Increasing food production is obvious. Integrating people and the environment into the research planning has been critical. If the research doesn't relate to the cultural environment or the natural environment, what happens? It doesn't get used. Expanding the role of markets where there's a surplus from the benefits of the research so that markets become something that channels funds back into another area and allows other development work to continue. Education, health, so forth. Where there's a surplus generated in cereals, moving into other crops that improve local nutrition or economics. Economy-wide policies. This means in many countries moving from policies set up in the colonial era for a totally different function to something that suits those countries today. And then improve food quality, which relates to the microbiology, the food safety. It also relates to the nutritional quality. And because that's a health function, we can also add in there from agricultural research the control of zoonotic diseases passing from livestock to humans and the aspect of micronutrients that are essential for human consumption that only come from animals. The number of successes is too many to mention. Here is a short list which I will not go through. I'll take 3 examples from this. The first one, wheat rust. Many people in the room know more about this than I do. It doesn't mean the research is done. It means the research has been able to produce these results and continues, because wheat, just as a biological organism, rust is also. So continuous mutation means continuous research, but with genetic tools, the researchers stay in front of the rust. The second example is Asia. In the first 20 years of the Green Revolution, 200% increases in income, predominantly in Asia, 2 billion extra people fed. Third example is down the bottom, China, the bottom 2. China has had amazing increases. It's more recent than 50 years ago that we predicted China could never feed itself. Nobody believed it. China did this. Now, it's popular to say China did this by itself because it was cut off from the rest of the world. I don't believe that's true. What China did is a logical, smart thing to do, of looking around the world, of all the research that's going on, and building on that with their own scientists, training their own scientists, and then creating that wonderful revolution. I say that because the stage we're at now means we must work with Chinese scientists. The greatest pool of scientists in the world, in any one country, we need to have those people working on these problems that I'm talking about. The Green Revolution is this graph. Population rose and grain production rose with it. The grain price hovers down around here, and Tony Gregson, as a grain producer, would like it to be much higher. I think you don't have to worry, Tony. It's going to happen. The most impressive slides in international agricultural work come from the animals. I don't just say that because of the International Livestock Research Institute Association I have, but you can have these graphs that go from 100% to 0. It's highly impressive. This is a slide indicating the control of rinderpest, translated as cattle plague. Rinderpest killed about 85 to 95% of cattle wherever it broke out. Africa, Europe, elsewhere. And it was gradually brought under control by a coordinated international effort in developing and developed countries to control that program. Professor Martin Jago is here tonight and was part of that program. This reduction is an example of only 2 diseases in the world that have been eradicated: smallpox and rinderpest. Amazing work by veterinary researchers in agricultural research. Not only was it eradicated, and the last outbreak was in 2001, FAO declared it eradicated in 2011, and this year, Pirbright Institute, where our Dean, John Fazakerley, was previously the CEO, has destroyed the stocks that were held under highly secure conditions because the virus has been decoded, and this is the information needed should there be anything related to it break out in future. These are huge successes in international agricultural research. The Green Revolution focused on increasing food quantity. This is a simple graph from our World in Data, which is using the best data available. And the countries I've chosen to put here are to illustrate that most of the world is above the 2,000 kilocalorie intake that was used as the baseline. The job is done in those terms. The fact that Zambia and Zimbabwe are below the line at the moment is suggestion of two important factors: bad governance and drought. The other aspect of the Green Revolution was a reduction in poverty. This graph indicates the huge success that's occurred over that time. At the moment, we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa and part of South Asia with some poverty. Now, this is in purchasing power parity terms, done by the World Bank to make the value of currency and purchases in one country equate to another, so that it's not what we call poverty here, it's not what we see as poverty here. This is real poverty of people without sufficient resources for basically staying alive. Another success story is shown in this graph, which is equally used by people that want to say about problems. In the early days, pie charts were square. So in 1960, the pink area shows the rich countries' contributions to international agricultural research and development. The blue areas showing the middle-income countries. The parity between those two has shifted to 2011 and is going further at the moment. This, I think, is a great sign of success. It means more countries in the world are contributing to this overall world problem of international agricultural research funding to keep food and nutritious food produced. And it also means that our contributions are being complemented and our inputs in the past have been picked up in middle-income countries. This is not only a sign of success in international agricultural research and development, but of development in general. I think we should talk in these terms rather than keep saying, oh, it looks like we're giving less. We're giving much more in absolute dollar terms. Another success factor, and this is a slide about general research and development personnel in 2015, is where the research and development specialists are in the world. Now, Australia's in a purple patch, as it is for most things. But what is most interesting about this slide is the colour that exists in Africa and Latin America and Asia. If this was 1960, we would see very pale colours there, possibly the 0 to 30 numbers. Why is this a success? Because the work that we've been engaged in has always involved training of new researchers. The universities, such as this one, have trained innumerable people who've gone back to their own countries with great PhDs, been supported through the international research system and contributed in their own countries. This is the future. If I put it into domestic terms, this is where future careers will be. Now, the Dean has told me that we don't have young people in the audience because they come for the free wine, not to listen to me. So I'm charging all of the people with grey hair in the room to talk to the young people they know, to tell them the opportunities are there and working with their colleagues in these other countries is the future. Another success story is the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. Before that, there were the Millennium Development Goals up to the turn of the millennium. Most of those were met. Now, it's popular to criticise anything about these international goals and targets, but the targets were set in a way that they were achievable. And having seen they were achievable, the world got together and most countries, virtually all countries, signed up to these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals' big success over the Millennium Development Goals is that they apply to all countries in the world, not just developing countries. And if anybody challenges this these days, that these don't apply to Australia as much as anywhere else in the world, just look at number 13 and talk about climate action. But every one of the others is exactly the same. No country is independent. Wealth does not change these things. The problems of the world are the problem of each country, of each expert in their own field. Another success has been the number of players in international agricultural research. Now, the whole field is peppered with acronyms, so I'm just using a few here. International agricultural research includes advanced research institutions, universities and CSIRO-type bodies around the world. The University of Melbourne is one, other universities in Australia, major universities in every country contributing and working often in concert with the CGIAR. The NRI is the national research institutions in developing countries that now have capacity, like a State Department of Agriculture or a CSIRO. Research capacity in these countries is now a major consideration and a funding contributor to this work. Institutions left over from the colonial period have morphed into development institutions such as CABI in the UK. And WV is shorthand for a range of other international research centres that are not part of the CGIAR. This is the World Vegetable Centre, and I see Cathy Reid is here today. Cathy's on the board of that centre. The other players in it are funders or users of the money. The World Bank, of course, is the largest through its loans. Regional development banks second. The BRICS, yes, Brazil, Russia, India and China are increasingly the funders and the providers of great international agricultural researchers. The United Nations, not so much for money, but for personnel and policy. Philanthropists, I can illustrate this simply by saying that in the CGIAR, the major donor is the United States. The second largest is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. These are huge amounts of money. The CGIAR is $1 billion per year. NGOs, some NGOs. We've heard all about ACR earlier. I simply want to point out one extra fact, that when the international research community got together in the 1980s, all of the rich countries were encouraged to set up an organisation that would quarantine part of their aid programs for international agricultural research. Only 2 countries responded and only one actually did it. Australia did it. Peter Horn is the representative tonight. The other country was Canada. They did it, but they made it into a development organisation as well, not just agricultural research. And the Crawford Fund exists to support that effort, not just through ACR, but through the CGIAR and other research centres. The reason it worked has been analysed to death. These 8 factors interact with each other to produce that success. It's not just science and technology. That's all I want to show here. We've heard about private incentives, leadership, all of these things. They have to work together. Each of these has its own chapter of great detail in the IFPRI reports. Yet, with all of that success, we reach this stage of today, where we have nearly 1 billion people malnourished. We've had price spikes that indicate the precariousness of the world's food situation. 2007 and 8, we hardly noticed it in Australia. Well, we didn't notice it in Australia, that the price spiked. And why did it spike? Because money doesn't buy food when it doesn't exist. The Middle East hadn't signed forward contracts to buy food. They suddenly rushed in, gazumped some other contracts, sent the price sky high. The Philippines had to meet the Middle Eastern prices for grain that they needed to import through their mismanagement of their own agriculture. We didn't notice it because the global financial crisis followed on soon afterwards. I think the food crisis was more important than the economic crisis. This slide is taken from our health colleagues about malnutrition, and it's a simple slide to indicate the cycles that develop from this. I don't want to dwell on it. It's simply young girls becoming pregnant. They have low birth weight babies because they're in a situation of inadequate nutrition. The child doesn't grow well, grows into a young woman that has a baby when she is still young and undernourished, and a cycle is perpetuated. It isn't just hard on the baby and the young girl, it's hard in other ways in terms of international development. The undernourished, we've seen on Peter's slide, I don't need to dwell on that. How do we address these things? Well, these 8 crops, 12 crops, are examples of what the CGIAR and its international research partners have worked on to enhance the micronutrients necessary to form balanced diets. This is done, a lot of it, through traditional breeding. It's important to realise that traditional plant breeding remains more important for products than genetic engineering. Now, in this room, I know we have molecular biologists who see the world in a different way. It's really critical, but it has specific targets. Some of this relied on molecular biology. The second part for micronutrients relates to animal-sourced foods. The most important one for the future, in my opinion, is fish. Now we're in a situation that there are more farmed fish in the world than caught fish. This tells us that this is becoming a major dietary component in more and more areas, and particularly poor areas where a pond of tilapia, bred especially through the World Fish Programme, makes a huge difference to people. Milk is another product. Eggs is another. Milk has been a great success story, and it combines 2 elements. The work of the International Livestock Research Institute is one part. The major part is from India's own work through its inspirational, charismatic man, Dr. Kurian, in the 1960s and 70s, where not only did he recognise that it was the women who were milking the cows and bringing the milk to the delivery point, but he realised he could teach about dairy production to them, and he could teach about the reproductive cycle of dairy cows to those women, and that's how the reproductive cycle became understood in rural villages in India, in the zone where dairy was produced and population began to subside. It was a marvellous program, an inspirational biography, Dr. Kurian. Why animal research? Now, this is what we often find in terms of why should we eat so much meat? Livestock are bad for the environment. Here are 4 factors. Nutrition. The recommendation is still 20 grams of animal protein per day, 1.5 eggs. Income. The example I give is Dr. Jacob Mignauna from Togo. Poor, very poor family. Being poor in Togo is being really poor. His mother had a few extra eggs every day. The eggs provided a tiny extra income, enough to get young Jacob to school. Young Jacob was bright. He went on, got scholarships. He now manages BECA, Biosciences for East and Central Africa, a major research enterprise for African scientists to serving African needs. Livestock are mobile. Pastoral and nomadic lifestyles where people depend totally on animals remains a major lifestyle for hundreds of thousands up to several millions of people. And the livestock can move, particularly with climate changes. They have always moved according to rains. Now they have to move in different areas, and those people still rely on them and can still survive. The last one is integration. The simple way to say this is that most farms in the world are crop livestock farms. Most farms in the world are in Asia. The second greatest number are in Africa. That's where most of the farmers are, where most of the farms are, and mostly they're based on crop livestock systems, because on a small farm, nutrient cycling is really important. Just like in a rainforest, the nutrients can recycle within if you have all of the biological components. If you move to more of a monocropping system, you have to look after those inputs yourself. The last slide about animal source foods is the critical one. And this comes from Dahlia Grace, an Irish veterinary researcher at Ilree of international fame. She has put together some serious papers in Science and Nature concerning the essential micronutrients that must come from animals or are most easily sourced from animal source products. From conception to more than the first 1,000 days of life. Now, The first 9 months is taken care of. Animal source foods are gained by the fetus because the mother is an animal. That's easy. After birth, milk from the mother. After that, animal-sourced foods. In order to get vitamin A or retinol and heme, which are much more easily absorbed from animal products than from plant products. Vitamin B12, which doesn't exist in plant products. If we think we're getting vitamin B12 on a vegetarian diet, we're getting fortified products in fortified almond milk or fortified cereal products. And choline, of emerging research of its role in neurotransmission, memory, and gene expression. These are critical things in a development phase, and as I'll say in the final slide, why this fits in for research for development. So these are not just issues that are worth doing because we've found out some new science. They're actually part of making development work. The statement in red from Dahlia Grace is simply a policy statement trying to influence people and counter some of the negative messages that are coming from certain groups in developed countries, and they have an impact on government, which then steers its money away from some of this critical work. This is trying to introduce facts into an emotional argument. So to summarise some of the current and future needs, health, obviously the micronutrients is a major part. Food safety is a major part. Traditional products in developing countries have often figured this out, so fermented fish products and a whole lot of strange things that we might not eat turn out to be very safe. Practices in meat markets in Vietnam have shown that their open-air markets with the meat laying all over the concrete in the early morning are actually improvements in microbiological terms over the abattoirs introduced mimicking our systems. Health, of course, includes zoonotic diseases, and I'm conscious of my veterinary colleagues in the room, a major area. Climate change influences everything. The important thing for an agricultural scientist to keep saying to the world is agriculture has always dealt with climate change. That's what it's about, adapting plants and animals to the environment as it changes, adapting the environment where possible to those plants and animals. That's what agricultural science is. Migration is related to food, and food is related to conflict. There will be a book released next week in Canberra, Cambridge University Press. The title is simply Food or War. Wonderful alternatives. Food leads to war. Food insecurity leads to war is the thesis of the book. In between, you have situations of war erupting for other reasons, a shortage of another resource, water may be a reason. Food is then used as a weapon to further those wars. Even the situation in Syria has partially been related to food insecurity for families deciding enough is enough and having to move through that. It's not necessarily the way our news is presented, but these are factors. I commend this book. Professor Julian Cribb is the author. Employment. In the areas I'm talking about, agriculture constitutes 75 down to 70% of employment for these people. Employment is important because a little bit of extra money out of agriculture enables other development. And that's what we talk about. It's not just to have enough to eat, it's to have a good balanced diet so that other forms of development in health, in education, and other things can proceed from that. Then we come to production, and that's what everyone in this room knows about in terms of sustainable intensification in order to minimise leakage from agricultural systems into the wider environment, in order to increase the recycling of nutrients. Dali Chen's work to have nitrogen applied that only the plant uses, rather than have it leak into the wider environment. And in this area, I will also put greenhouse gas emissions. This comes out of more intensive production. In case livestock escapes from this discussion, let me just say the main form of livestock intensification is the ability to reduce mortality and increase reproduction so that less animals need to be maintained. Less animals, More efficient means less greenhouse gas emissions. Genetic modification, huge impact in terms of disease tolerance, pest tolerance, adapting to climate change, and increasingly it will relate to micronutrients. And underpinning all of this is agricultural education, which is reliant on the traditional agricultural science education that is integrated from the social through the pure and applied sciences in one cohesive package to provide a foundation where people can use other knowledge to build. This is the type of applied research capacity that comes out of good universities. All of this is needed together with the things at the bottom of this slide in sub-Saharan Africa, West Asia, North Africa regions. To emphasise 2 points before I finish. On the left-hand side, the drivers of food crises, economic changes, conflict and climate. You can see that lists of countries there, they're not surprising. Putting two of those together, just conflict and climate, you get other countries or parts of those countries. If all three occurred, it's a catastrophe. On the right-hand side, we have the detailed economic analysis outputs from IFPRI talking about the impact of climate change relative to international agricultural research. On the left, the green column is where we are today. Where we would be in 2050 is the second green column if the research applications continued as they have been, and there's a reason to assume they might be. That's if there was no climate change. With climate change, it's the yellow one. The three blue bars on the right relate to increased funding, half as much again for the first one, twice as much for the next one, and the final one is twice as much research and development funding in agriculture, plus faster adoption rates. The two things come together there. Adoption rates is social science, the yield increases, the research and development is the technological side. The reason we are here tonight, courtesy of the Dean, is the Derrick tribe created the Crawford Fund to support a food secure world. A food secure world today means a food that is not just sufficient in quantity, but in quality. This is done through the Crawford Fund's programs that have been enunciated by Colin earlier. So my final slide, trying to tie together some of those points. The future will not involve just technological research. The needs are for integrated understanding of the research context and people planning that research and remaining aware of their social and environmental context. I've used malnutrition as an example of one of the major continuing issues that the next generation is taking over from us. Malnourishment affects people in two ways. One is stunting, which is easy to measure. The other is less easy to measure. It's interrupted mental development. Interrupted mental development means that these people don't learn as well. If we've got 800 million people in the world that might be at threat of this, it means our educational investment, which is huge in the developing world, is not being used efficiently because these people aren't able to learn as fast as expected. And education is the key to development. Education of women is a key to development. We need to have malnourishment addressed in that issue. The third line is the usual things: yield increases, pest and disease resistance, zoonotic diseases, diseases that come from livestock and morph into something that affects humans. Think of SARS and other bad diseases, all the worst diseases. Antimicrobial resistance, a problem caused not only by developing countries, but particularly by Europe and the US, of using antibiotics excessively in livestock production. Safe foods, recycling, collecting nutrients from waste and recycling, and having policy that relates to what is needed today rather than what somebody thought was necessary in the past. All happening within a period of rapid climate change. The lessons for the young people that I ask you to take to the young people, you know, seeing they're not allowed to drink wine and have nibbles, is that what we have done and how we have done it, yes, there have been successes and we should be proud of that and tell people, but it won't be done that way in the future. Some of it will continue, but what we have done isn't the way it's necessarily going to work for the next generation. Our experience is useful. We just can't tell people to follow a career the way we have. It will be different. If I had to predict what it is, the next generation will be interculturally literate and aware, much more. There'll be young Australians who speak Asian languages, one of the great deficits of this country. They will be integrationists who understand from a good basic education how to build other knowledge from that. And when I look around the world and I see the young people coming from the developed countries, from good universities, from this country and from other countries, I think the world is in good hands for the future. Thank you.